Okay, so we are live, and I want to welcome our Saturday keynote, Mandalas of Consciousness, East and West, Jeffrey Kiehl.
Thank you.
We warmed him up for you.
I'm in that enviable position. I stand between you and your drinks. We know what is more important. I would like to begin by thanking the organizing committee for inviting me to give this keynote presentation. It is very meaningful for me to be here at Naropa University in Boulder. I first came to Boulder in the summer of 1978 and lived here for nearly 40 years before moving to Santa Cruz, California 3 years ago. I have very strong connections to this place and these mountains. Lama Govinda, whose picture there is in the center, had this to say about mountains, quote, "To see the greatness of a mountain, one must keep one's distance. To understand its form, one must move around it. To experience its moods, one must see it at sunrise and sunset, at noon and at midnight, in sun and in rain, in snow and in storm, in summer and in winter, and in all other seasons. He who can see the mountains like this comes near to the life of the mountain, a life that is as intense and varied as that of a human being. I encourage all of you to find some time to dwell with the mountains that are so close, for we can learn so much from them." Given that the theme of this conference is Gebser in Asia, Theory, Practice, Engagement, it is quite fitting that we are meeting here at Naropa, which was founded by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche in 1974, whose picture is on the right. Boulder meant so much to Rinpoche, and many of his important teachings were delivered here in the nearby hills. I must confess, I am not a scholar of the writings of John Gebser. I have been studying his writings for only 6 years. And I thank my friend John Dotson for introducing me to Gebser. My connection to Buddhism is longer and deeper than it is to Gebser. I first began studying Buddhism 50 years ago and became a practitioner 40 years ago. I have followed the path of Zen for many years and then studied and practiced Shambhala Buddhism. At this point in life, I find myself on an individual Buddhist journey, with the Dharma continually providing me with deep meaning and my practice continuing to be central to my life. I certainly do not claim to be an expert on Buddhism in any way, and any misrepresentations I make this evening, about Buddhism arise from my ever-present ignorance of the Dharma. Finally, I must confess a deep-felt connection to Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. Even though I never met him in this world, he was around when I was around here. A few years ago, I had a profound dream in which Rinpoche and I met, and I was relaying to him that I would be speaking at Naropa. He smiled, and he actually put his head against my head twice. He smiled. Given that dream encounter, I am deeply indebted to Rinpoche for granting me this opportunity to speak here today at his university. So with those personal recollections and apologia, let me begin. Engaging with a world in crisis. We are living in a time of tremendous and profound upheaval, socially, politically, and environmentally. Belief systems that have maintained our social fabric for centuries are unraveling before our eyes. Humans have reached the point in history in which their actions have pushed the world towards climate disruption of unprecedented magnitude. We feel completely helpless given the global extent and intensity of these phenomena. Our world is in crisis. What are we to do? How are we to engage with such a world? We are witnessing firsthand the degradation of our global environment and our fear to engage with the cause of this phenomenon. We fear to engage with the ultimate cause, for it reflects too painfully on our limited consciousness. Engagement is rooted in how we perceive the world and how much we care about the world. If we clearly perceive and care enough, then we engage the world in right action. Perception is critical for engaging the world, and how we perceive is grounded in consciousness. Perception is refracted through our beliefs, our habitual patterns, as Rinpoche would call them. Perception depends on perspective and its intensity, which is why Gebser plays such a critical role in understanding our process of engaging. It is also why Buddhism plays such a critical role in our path. For Buddhism is a spiritual exploration of how mind perceives world. What I want to do this evening is weave together representations of consciousness so that we have a better understanding of how to constructively engage with the world. I will use the words of Gebser, Govinda, and Rinpoche to explore ways to accomplish this task of weaving. Jean Gebser, Lama, Anagarika, Govinda, and Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche each left their country of origin and settled in foreign lands. Each left their homelands with few material possessions, but in their own way, each carried something of far greater value, a way of seeing and experiencing the world. Each man had profound experiences concerning the world. Jean Gebser witnessed the rise of authoritarianism in his homeland of Germany and again in his adopted home of Spain. He fled from the shadows of totalitarianism to Switzerland, where he gathered his thoughts on the structures of consciousness. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche was forced to flee Tibet. He settled in India and England until finally moving to America in 1970. Lama Govinda left his homeland of Germany to settle in Italy to study art and Buddhism, then moved to Ceylon, then India, eventually moving to America. Gebser and Govinda experienced the horrors of world wars. Trungpa witnessed the destruction of Tibet. So these were men who were quite familiar with what mankind is capable of doing. Gebser states that, quote, "The crisis of our world is in a process of complete transformation and appears headed toward an event which can only be described as a global catastrophe. If we do not overcome the crisis, it will overcome us. Either we will be disintegrated and dispersed, or we must resolve and effect integrality." Gebser goes on to say elsewhere, "Where do I come from? Who am I? Whither do I go?" We believe that so long as we do not find an answer to those questions, primal fear reigns. It is the trigger for aggression and depression, which can lead to the destruction of others or of oneself. Very Buddhist. Only he who finds an answer to these three questions awakens to primal trust and is thus freed from primal fear. Lama Govinda observed that, quote, "The torn and tortured human being of our time has lost the connection with his timeless being and is like a man suffering from incurable amnesia." While Rinpoche observed that, quote, "This is the darkest hour of the dark ages. Disease, famine, and warfare are raging like the fierce north wind. The Buddha's teachings has waned in strength. No one acts according to the highest code of discipline, meditation, and wisdom." So you see, these individuals, we're very much attuned to the state that this world is in right now. And those words were written even before the catastrophe that faces us right now. I want to put this in context. If we continue on the path that we're on right now, we are going to more than triple the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the next 80 years. There's not been that much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for 40 million years. In a century, we're going to return Earth to where it was 40 million years ago. And I can tell you what that world was like. It's nothing the human species has ever experienced. And we're going to do it in the lifetime of a human being. One can see similarities within these various reflections on the world. First, the intensity of destruction is rooted in our state of consciousness. Second, that there is a deep spiritual source transcending our individual egos, a source that is ever present, timeless. Third, our current age is rooted in aggression, ignorance, and separation, and we are required to find primal trust and overcome primal fear. I will use maps of mandalas to explore how Gebser, Govinda, and Rinpoche addressed our global catastrophe. The mandala is an archetypal pattern that appears in cultures worldwide. What is mandala? Rinpoche states that, quote, as a basic principle, mandala is that which is contained in everyday life. Wherever there is relationship, that seems to be the mandala principle, end quote. And that, quote, the basic mandala principle becomes very simple. It is that everything is related to everything else. It is quite simple and straightforward. If only we could experience that. Mandalas provide images of living processes and portals for transformation. They live within us and outside of us. They connect the relative to the absolute, the macrocosm to the microcosm, the perspectival to the aperspectival. Gebser, the Mandala of Consciousness. Let us imagine a space that is unborn and timeless, a place from which everything arises. I picture here a place of great space, the ever-present origin. Of course, this is just an image that I imagine, for it is difficult to actually picture this space. It is best experienced. It's exactly what it's supposed to be. It is no thing. Out of the ever-present, out of this ever-present origin arises modes of experience, representations of the phenomenal world. These representations create ontogenies and epistemologies. They create an epi-ontic reality structuring consciousness. Gebser presented them as conscious forms of development and stressed that they coexist within us. According to Gebser, we live in this mandala, and the mandala lives through us. In working with a mandala, one circumambulates it. One enters the mandala from a particular point and then moves around it, or you let it move around in you. With each part of the mandala, the representation presentiates themselves, you aware the mandala. Okay? Let us enter this mandala through the archaic, of which Gebser says it is the closest to and presumably originally identical with origin. It is origin, emanating from that perfect identity existing before all oneness, end quote. Interestingly, Gebser provides much more information on the other representations of consciousness than that of the archaic. Personally, I feel the archaic is quite important in addressing our separation from the natural world. It seems to be related to, and we can debate this later, it seems to be related to what is called participatio mystique, in which I and other are indistinguishable. Clearly, we experience this state when we are in nature, where we may lose a sense of separateness and feel the numbness of zero-dimensionality. Spending time with this part of the mandala allows us to taste the origin and numinosity associated with it. I think we were doing that outside. Returning from such a state leaves us with a sense of familiarity that enables care for the world. You see, we can use each one of these modes of representation to re-engage with the world. That's what I'm going to encourage you to do with each of these mandalic structures. They're windows, they're portals into reconnecting to the world. And once you're reconnecting and you perceive it as it truly is, you're engaged in a way where your actions will be true and right. Moving clockwise into the magic, Gebser notes that, quote, for the first time, not only was man in the world, but began to face the world. There arose a need of no longer being in the world, but having the world. That's a very different concept of having the world, rather than being in the world. He further notes that, quote, in the magic structure, the vital connections reach awareness and are manifested in emotional forms. Now we bring in emotions. This relates to what Hans was talking about yesterday. In actions dominated by impulse and instinct, end quote. With this representation of consciousness, we see other as separate and experience emotions and impulses of attraction or repulsion. We are drawn to or move away from other. Associated with the magic is the ability to influence the other for good or ill. A sense of control of the environment enters with the magic. Our current manipulation of the environment is an expression of this magic, in which the modern magicians are the scientists and technologists whose actions bring good or ill to our engagement with the world. Continuing our journey around the mandala, we come to the mythical. Gebser says that the mythical structure encompasses, balances, and ties together all polarities. First, I notes, quote, with the emergence of the mythical, imagination was added to the cognitive repertoire of humanity. Very critical way of knowing. These are all ways of knowing. Okay, these are all ways of knowing. We're locked into just one way of knowing right now. What Gebser provides us with, and we'll see these other gentlemen that we're going to talk about later, all provide us with many ways of knowing. This mode also opens us to the empathic feeling at a deep level. It invites us to create myths of origins, including evolution, which is our current living myth of beginnings. We heard about that this morning. Polarities pervade our world and perpetuate themselves. Our country is a polarized nation in which concretized mythologies provide self-substantiated solace. The internet becomes a source for stories to self-soothe ourselves. For example, roughly half the nation doesn't consider human-caused global warming a reality, while in fact 97% of the scientific community consider it a reality. Moving on, we come to the mental structure, which Feuerstein calls, quote, the crystallization of the ego. And we're going to look at that later through a Buddhist lens. We are in the realm of reason, discernment, and perspectivity, the three-dimensional world where we are most comfortable. It is the world of causality, which is quite significant for science. For science is rooted in causality. If we understand causal mechanisms, we can predict the future. We reside within measured time. How does all of this relate to engaging with our environment, our environmental crisis? Climate science applies the natural laws of physics to this rotating sphere called Earth. Natural laws rooted in causality allow us to project into the future and also look into the past. We make causal connections to deduce that humans are changing our climate. Science makes us aware of the time required to act in order to avoid catastrophic changes of the future. And as we heard this weekend, that time is now dwindled to 12 years. Finally, we move to the center of the mandala, which according to Gebser is absolutely essential for dealing with our looming crises. He states that, quote, the growth of a new integral consciousness is important, even decisive for our times, for it is a theme of universal scope, embracing the whole of humanity. As such, it deserves to be treated as a coherent whole, for the common destiny of Asia and the Occident depends largely upon the extent to which this new consciousness is realized. The new consciousness has nothing to do with intellectual knowledge. Its character is derived from spiritual, not from purely intellectual values. Spirit has entered the room. This is a profound statement from Gebser, for it says that integral consciousness arises from spiritual values, not intellectual knowing. This observation provides a bridge to what is to come when we look to the East and what Buddhism offers in terms of engaging the world. Gebser argues that what is required is a, quote, structural change in our perception of reality. This whole talk is about perception, by the way. Characterized in the three words, the overcoming of dualism. By entering the center of the mandala, we fall into a non-dual state, quote, that, quote, changes man so that the spiritual becomes transparent to him. It is important to note that this mutation requires a change in our perception of reality. I feel this is a critical aspect of the A-dimensional. It is also the central tenet of my presentation, i.e. that our engagement with the world depends critically on how we perceive the world. How do we enter the center of Gebser's mandala? How does this mutation occur within us? It has been observed that he provides little practical advice concerning this question. He describes what the integral is, but his roadmap to get to the center is less clear. However, there are many hints we can glean from his writings. For example, Gebser makes it clear that, quote, what is needed is not a way or a path, but a leap. The depths of the abyss are visible only when one leaps across, and surely we have seen enough of the abyss during recent decades. We are staring at that abyss. Can we leap? We are not talking about a mild mutation here. We are called to leap into the center of the mandala. Gebser further states that, quote, there is need for an inner attitude of going beyond oneself, by which one becomes capable of devotion or unconditional trust and self-opening, which is marked by an unforced, super-wakeful lucidity. The a-personal can only be perceived by an a-personal, ego-free individual, end quote. These words are in alignment with the path of Buddhism, rooted in freeing oneself from ego-centeredness, not the destruction of the ego, freeing oneself from ego-centeredness. Placing ourselves in a state of unconditional trust, we ourselves become transparent and the world becomes concrete and integral. The degree to which we enter this part of the mandala rests in particular on a particular kind of trust. Gebser tells us that, quote, primal trust is participation, conscious participation in the spiritual, and it is an unbroken, irresolvable being held in the spiritual, end quote. And again, we see how he emphasizes the importance of the spiritual when mutating to the center of this mandala. I have chosen to discuss the Mandala of Consciousness, emphasizing the efficient expressions of these representations. However, we know each of these modes of perception is accompanied by a deficient expression. So we start with a mandala, like this, and it bifurcates into efficient and deficient forms. In physics, a quantum state can exist in what is called degeneracy. And when that quantum state is placed in a magnetic or electric field, the state splits into two. It can actually split into more than two. Hidden within the single quantum state are two or more states. I envision Gebser's structures in this way. Inherent in the manifestations of consciousness, the representations of consciousness, are the efficient and deficient. In fact, Gebser explains the states in manifold forms, like these. So you can imagine this splitting out in a multidimensional space. What is the field that separates out these variations and manifestations? What is that field? I propose it is the intensity with which we live life, the psychic depth to which we experience our worlds. Each of these structures allows us to engage with the world in unique ways. For example, right now, we lack imagination regarding global warming. We need to imagine a world without fossil fuels. For until we do this, we will continue to be caught up in the illusion that we cannot live without them. I encourage you to play with these mandalas by bringing your intensity of experience to bear on a problem you face in life. Play in the field of the mandala, dance around, and within these forms of consciousness. If you do, your field of experience will shift in mysterious ways. You will experience the sacredness of the everyday world. Govinda, the Mandala of multidimensional consciousness. I'd like to now move on to consider Lama Govinda and his contribution to engaging the world. I include Govinda in this presentation, for he provides a bridge between Gebser and Rinpoche. Govinda was born Ernst Lothar Hoffmann in Waldheim, Germany in 1898. While in the army during World War I, he contracted tuberculosis and was discharged. He moved to Italy and studied art and Buddhism. He then moved to Ceylon in the 1920s to practice Theravadan Buddhism and converted to Tibetan Buddhism, eventually settling in India. He made a number of trips to Tibet to study with lamas and to document Buddhist art in various remote regions of Tibet. Later he moved to California and was befriended by Suzuki Roshi of the San Francisco Zen Center, seen here in this slide, and also Alan Watts. It was actually Suzuki Roshi and Alan Watts that brought Lama Govinda and his wife to Marin County. He passed away in 1985 at the age of 86. He met and communicated with John Gebser, recognizing in Gebser a Westerner who understood consciousness and how it could facilitate needed transformation. Govinda also met Trungpa Rinpoche. The Buddhist teacher Jack Kornfield writes that, quote, while Lama Govinda was living in Almora in the Himalayas of India in the 1950s and early 1960s, many people escaping from Tibet came through his household, and many of the lamas would stay with him. He said that of all the young tulkus, the young incarnate lamas to leave Tibet, there was none so bright as Trungpa Rinpoche. He meant bright in the sense of the field of his being and his energy. Lama Govinda told me, Cornfield, this at a point when he wasn't very happy with the way Trungpa Rinpoche was behaving. He said, quote, I still have to admit, there was no one who walked across the Himalayas and came out of Tibet who had the light more than Trungpa. Govinda was fascinated by the development of consciousness, and in an early work published in 1938, portrays various states of consciousness grouped within three major representations, as shown here: emotional, mental, spiritual. And this is the evolution of those through time. This is in 1938. What he developed was fully with his explication of mudras, mantras, and mandalas, as seen here. I don't have time to explore this mandala in any detail. This is the mandala of the five Buddha families. We're going to come back to this when we talk about Rinpoche's interpretation of this. But I felt it's important for you to see how Govinda presented these expressions of Vajrayana. Here we have a mandala of the five Buddha families. Note that each energy form is associated with the direction. East is always the south. Downward position downward position. South is to the west, to the left. Up, north, to the right. In each of these directions, there's a wisdom embodiment. Mogasiddhi, Abhishoka, Ratnasambhava. Each has their own Buddha nature. They have a color: white, yellow, red, green, and blue. And those are lucky few on Friday when we did into the rooms of the Maitri rooms. These are the Maitri rooms. They each have an element associated with them. Earth, that goes with yellow, fire with red, air, green, and white water, and space in the middle. Space is the fifth element in the Buddhist cosmology. And they, like I said, they also have an embodiment of mirror-like wisdom. You rotate clockwise around this mandala, you enter from the east, and you work with each of these energies. In the center is the void. Govinda says the void is not the negation merely of our limited personality, but the plenum void, which includes, embraces, and nourishes it like the womb of space, in which the light moves eternally without ever being lost. This aspect of the center sounds quite similar to Gebser's description of origin. Govinda also described the importance of dimensionality in the path to awareness. For example, in an essay called The Mystery of Time, he states that, quote, time and space constitute the two greatest mysteries of the human mind. Deeper even than the mystery of space is that of time. So deep, in fact, that it took humanity thousands of years to become conscious of its implications, end quote. This resonates with Gebser's view that, quote, this is Gebser, this mutation into the aperspectival will bear its fruits of transforming the world if we succeed in superseding the eruption of time. But that is tantamount to what we have called the presentiation of origin, which can be achieved only by coming to consciousness of time freedom. I think we've experienced time freedom here in the last day. In the same mystery of time, Govinda says that, quote, an experience of reality cannot be defined but only circumscribed, i.e., it cannot be approached by the straight line of two-dimensional logic, but only in a concentric way, and moving around it, approaching it not only from one side, but from all sides. Sound familiar? Without stopping at any particular point. Only in this way can we avoid a one-sided and perspectively foreshortened and distorted view, and arrive at a balanced, unprejudiced perception and knowledge. This concentric approach is the exact opposite of the Western analytical and dissecting way of observation. One of the unique things about Lama Govinda is he was a Westerner who went to the East and lived in the East, practiced in the East, and then came back to the West. So he holds these two ways of seeing the world. This concentric approach is the exact opposite of the Western analytical and dissecting way of observation. It is the integral concentration of inner vision, dhyana. This integrating vision and the new conception of the world that is born from it has been formulated by one of the most creative and significant philosophers of our time, Jean Gebser. That's Govinda. I hope that I've convinced you of how highly Govinda viewed Gebser's work and from Cornfield's quote, how highly regarded Trungpa Rinpoche, to whom we now turn. You're almost going to get your drink soon. Trungpa Rinpoche, Mandala of Vajra Master. Speaking of drinking. Mandala of a Vajra Master. I love this photo. He had this, you talk to people that when he stared at you like this, you were scared shitless. Unfortunately, there is insufficient time to present a detailed biography of Trungpa Rinpoche this evening. He was a tremendously gifted teacher who brought Tibetan Buddhism to the West. He was a controversial teacher, living a crazy wisdom lifestyle that confused many. Rinpoche was a tulko, which means he was the reincarnation of the preceding Trungpa, and most importantly, able to receive terma, or sacred writings left either in physical or mental form by Padmasambhava, the guru who took Buddhism to Tibet in the 8th century. Rinpoche fled Tibet in 1959 after China invaded his homeland. He was 19 at the time and was the head of a large monastery in eastern Tibet. He lived in India until 1963 when he moved to England to study at Oxford. By the way, he did not get a degree from Oxford. He was only there for like a semester or two. He co-founded a retreat center in Scotland in 1967. And then in 1970, he immigrated to the United States and founded communities in Vermont and here in Boulder. He lived here in Boulder until 1986. And over the 16 years he lived in the United States, he traveled and lectured tirelessly. There are thousands and thousands of hours of recorded lectures by Trungpa that haven't even been transcribed yet. He passed away in 1987 at the age of 47. He was recognized by Buddhist teachers from diverse schools as one of the greatest Buddhist teachers of the 20th century. Just one final note, in the late 70s, he received a terma that led to the foundation of Shambhala, which is a secular path form of his teachings. And I encourage you, if you have time, I suggest you visit the Shambhala Center downtown. The third floor of that building is the main shrine room, which is quite an experience. To explore the mandala, let us begin with the unborn state. Okay? In the beginning, there is open space, beginning belonging to know. And within that space is primeval intelligence, or vidya. So there is both intelligence and space. You are this space. You are one with it. Because it is so spacious, you begin to whirl about and dance about. At some point, space is no longer space as such. It has become solid space because of your unnecessary urge to contract it. You have solidified space and made it tangible. That sense of space, consciousness, is the birth of duality. And a mandala arises out of that space. And what we're going to explore is how that contraction solidifies itself, and that is known as in the form of the 5 skandhas, or 5 heaps. We begin in a state of complete open primordial spaciousness, out of which arises a mandala of experiencing the world. How does such an arising of consciousness occur? John asked me this. What does Rinpoche say about how does our ego get here? Well, the best I could find in his writings, and I've read all of them numerous times, there is no logical answer to this question. In one seminar, Rinpoche, he was asked this question, and he says, space just burps us out. And here we are. The first expression of such a burp is form, which is the birth of I and other. This is the thing that Hans drew up here. At first, I'm here, Hans is there. I and other. Duality arises at this point. Once this occurs, according to Rinpoche, you forget what you have done. You forget about being birthed out of this space and are completely overwhelmed by ignorance. Duality and ignorance are born and arise. After form arises feeling, of which Rinpoche says that, quote, having solidified the duality of self and other, you try to feel the qualities of that other. This is again what Hans was talking about. You try to feel the qualities of that other in order to reassure yourself that you exist. These are all processes to create a separate ego, and then reaffirm that ego exists. Because if it doesn't, that's a scary thing, right? You reach out to sense whether that other is seductive, threatening, or neutral. After feeling arises perception impulse, continuing the process of reaching out and solidifying ego. With perception, we, quote, respond to the feeling information in 3 ways: by drawing in, pushing away, or being indifferent. That's the cockroach and the strawberry. Okay? I'm drawn to the food, I'm moving away, I'm repulsed by the cockroach. Okay? You make judgments. Okay? Now you're starting to see how ego's solidifying here? I don't want to go over there by the cockroach. I'd rather be over there. I'm making a judgment. This can be viewed as the refinement of the feeling process. Note how these states of becoming connect with Gebser structures of consciousness. Remember that with the mythical came impulse and feeling. Then once we have established the form of the other, and whether we are drawn to it or not, we define the other by continuing to solidify it through naming, which is the stage of concept formation. Here, according to Rinpoche, quote, we use the intellect to confirm our experience, to interpret weakness as strength, to fabricate security, and to verify our ignorance. Although primordial intelligence is happening all the time, all of this is happening with that space, within the space. although it's happening all the time. Let me see, I lost my thread here. To interpret weakness as strength, to fabricate security, and to verify our ignorance, although primordial intelligence is happening all the time. It is being employed by ignorance, by dualistic fixation. So one way that the Buddhists look at this is in terms of absolute and relative. And now we're in the relative phenomenal world once this process is started. We try to construct the world and name it and separate ourselves. Finally we come to the fifth form of becoming, consciousness, which Rinpoche says, quote, is an amalgamation of feeling, the energy of perception impulse, the intellectualization of concept formation. You put them all together, you integrate them all together, and that combination produces thoughts and emotions. At this level, we find emotional upheavals and uncontrollable and illogical patterns of discursive thought. We have now formalized our ego, and it's a game. Okay, we continually go around and around, and you can actually there's very minute forms of time associated with each of these. It happens very quickly, like that. These 5 modes of becoming arise so quickly that it appears as a continuous process, but it's not. Each mode takes a finite amount of time to arise. So there is a small gap between each step. After each complete coming to ego awareness, the process repeats itself. We repeat. We repeat. So the situation actually looks like this. Between each moment of awareness, there's a gap. And this gap is extremely important to our mandala of consciousness and how we engage in the world. With each step, our experience of the world is filtered and refracted. It is tinted by concepts rooted in habitual patterns creating our neuroses. That's exactly how Trungpa defined neuroses. Immersion in habitual patterns that reaffirm our ego structure. How do we pierce through this veil to see the world without illusions? The answer lies within the gap. Seeing the sacred world, the world as it is, that is ever present, lies within the gap. And the good news is we can train our minds to experience it. Trungpa says this, quote, when you discover that your unwholesome discursive thoughts have been pacified and subjugated, there might be a gap. A pure gap of the absolute, ideal state of mind might occur to you. For everyone, without exception, such a glimpse is always possible. At some point you realize that it is more than a glimpse, more than a possibility. This gap is related to the Buddhist concept of emptiness. As Trungpa explains, quote, throughout our life, there are possibilities of encountering gaps in our expectations. Usually we think in terms of hope and fear, but something beyond hope and fear is possible. Emptiness is also taking place. In addition, Trungpa says that after the gap, there is an expression of that gap, which is first thought. First thought, best thought. How often do we hesitate or dismiss first thought? But it may be the initial sign that we were in the gap of seeing the sacred world before us. We have now covered the mandala of the becoming of ego consciousness. This is an important mandala to understand, for it is where everything begins. It is the arising from primordial mind, a state of full luminosity, that then transforms into duality. It is apparent in Trungpa's teachings how important this concept is, for he often referred to this structure of becoming. Experiencing this mandala is the first step on the path of transformation. For we experience ego freedom, so important to Gebser. Rinpoche says, quote, in the state of egolessness, everything is simple and very clear. When we try to supplement the brightness of egolessness by putting a lot of other things into it, those things obscure its brilliance, becoming blockages and veils. How does this particular mandala relate to engaging the world? Gebser noted that we need a perspectival non-dual consciousness to address our world crises. And Trungpa would certainly agree with this. For it is our dualistic, egoic, neurotic state that creates the problems we experience, like global warming. And we cannot use this egoic state to solve our problems. That's where we are right now. Dualism separates us from the world as it is. Actions arising from this confused state ultimately result in suffering. For our perceptions of the world are so skewed that we cannot see its inherent sacred nature. Our task is to find the gap and penetrate the egoic self-restoration process that maintains our dualistic relative reality. The message is, find the gap, and you experience the absolute reality of primordial luminous mind. How do we accomplish this? Essential to experiencing the gap is taming the mind. And the way to tame the mind is through meditation. Now I'm going to become a minister. Rinpoche stressed over and over in his teachings the importance of meditation. Now, given this, we must ask, is there a potential problem in relating Buddhism to Gebser's ideas? For Gebser's writings do not reflect strong support for meditation practices. I confess I'm not familiar with all of his writings, and I've heard some new ones here these last few days. But I find it interesting that in Alan Combs' book, he relates conversations with people who personally knew Gebser, finding that later in his life, he was open to meditation practices. Personally, as a Buddhist, I feel meditation is essential for taming the mind. I don't deny there may be other practices to accomplish this, but for me, meditation is an essential means for working with the mandala of ego's becoming. There are other ways to transmute our egoic engagement with the world within the Vajrayana teachings. One of these is the mandala of the 5 Buddha families, or 5 Buddha principles, which I alluded to when I was discussing Govinda. Here we see 3 mandalas representing the ego, the mandala of ego construction. That's down at the bottom. That's the one we just worked through. The mandala of emotions, or kleshas, and the mandala of Buddha wisdoms, or energies. Note that each state of ego development is related to an emotion and wisdom. So you can imagine these are sort of the efficient and deficient modes as Gebser maps them out. So form is related to anger. As soon as you get into that state of I and other, you can fall into a state of anger. And you can work with that anger, and this is the Vajrayana way of working with things. You don't avoid the anger, you go into the anger. And you work with the anger, through the anger, to create mirror-like perception or experience. The important point is that we can transmute ego forms. This is alchemical. You transmute ego forms and emotions into manifestations of wisdom. Rinpoche states that, quote, by perceiving the energies of the Buddha families in people and in situations, you see that confusion is workable. It's a favorite word of his. It's workable. Confusion is workable and can be transformed into an expression of sacred outlook. For, he says, goes on to say, by working with the 5 Buddha families, we are trying to develop some basic understanding of how to see things in their absolute essence, their own innate nature. The 5 Buddha family principles seem to cover a whole new dimension of perception. They are very important at all levels of perception in all creative situations. 5 Buddha principles shift our perception and experience of the phenomenal world. It is important to note that although there appear to be 5 forms, they are not separate. There are 5 different manifestations of one basic energy. That's Trungpa. They're 5, you may look at them as 5, but they're all integrated into one. I cannot do justice to the 5 Buddha families in time remaining. Suffice to say that this figure shows that samsara and nirvana exist together. Don't fall into the illusion that the job is to release ourselves from samsara and ascend into nirvana. They coexist. And we move through these planes of perception from moment to moment. We can experience the solidification of form as duality, which manifests as anger in us. The anger can manifest in the phenomenal world as aggression to another. This anger also opens us up to mirror-like wisdom, which provides us with a sharpness of experience and awakening reality. There is a clarity of perception that cuts through delusions. That's mirror-like wisdom. If we consider the center of these mandalas, then we see that at the level of ego formation, consciousness manifests in the form of ignorance, the central poison leading to all suffering. In a state of ignorance, we destroy our environment through the burning of fossil fuels, dumping of mining material into rivers, and the fracking of our lands. However, we can transmute this ignorance into the wisdom of all-encompassing space. It's the center of the mandala, returning us to the luminous, innate, or primordial wisdom of the world as it is. It's always there, always ever present. Based on our conditioning, past and present, each of us has a preferred Buddha principle, and it's worthwhile getting to know what your principle is, for it influences how you interact with the phenomenal world. By knowing your dominant Buddha principle, you engage with the world more efficiently. For example, how do I work to heal the harm we are doing to Earth? What gifts can I bring to this healing process? Finally, taking the lead. I've covered much this evening. I hope you have found some things of interest in what I've presented. We'd like to end with how we move from our current crisis to experiencing primal wisdom and ego freedom. As Gebser noted, what is required of us now is to leap, realizing that the leap occurs in a state of primal trust, not primal fear. Listen to what Rinpoche has to say about this. Quote, if we begin to be brave, we will be able to see how phenomena work. That is to say, we will really see how phenomena work, rather than having an intellectual kind of understanding of phenomena. We will see how the world works, how things operate in our lives. At that point, experience becomes penetrating. Some kinds of understanding or realization are hard to take, but we need to push further to take an immense leap. It is time to leap. We can no longer limit ourselves to an intellectual understanding of phenomena. We need to leap knowing that we are grounded in fearlessness and unconditionally trust the phenomenal world. If we do so, we experience the sacred nature of the world. The current destruction of our world has become too severe and cannot continue. We have an ethical responsibility rooted in the absolute reality of interconnectedness to act now, to leap. John Gebser, Lama Govinda, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche provide us with meaningful maps to engage with the world in transcendentally wise ways. We must now choose a path and leap across the abyss, collective darkness, and experience the primordial luminous reality of the world. I invite you to reflect on the fact that our gathering here creates a mandala. I ask each of us to hold this mandala in our hearts and that we begin to open ourselves to the beauty that surrounds us. If we hold this mandala, then we engage with one another and with Earth in wondrous ways, deeply rooted in wisdom and compassion.
So I just wanted to make a little announcement about tomorrow afternoon. I'll be